Welcome to Books in Five, where we are interviewing the authors of recently published books on relevant topics. I'm very excited to have my guest here with me today because he's written an excellent new book called World on the Brink. Dimitri, tell us about yourself and where are you joining us from today?
I'm joining you from Washington, D.C. As you said, I'm an author of World on the Brink, How America Could Beat China in the Race for the 21st Century. I run a geopolitical think tank in Washington, D.C. called Silverado Policy Accelerator, focused on great power competition, China and Russia, which is what the book is about, particularly China. My background is in national security and technology and cyber. I co-founded a company called CrowdStrike, one of the leading cybersecurity companies.
Great. Let's jump right into question number one. Let's lay the groundwork for the arguments in your book. Help us understand America's involvement with China's meteoric rise over the past few decades.
Well, there's no question that China would not be the superpower in the economic terms, certainly, that it is today, and consequentially a growing military power without American support and American assistance, right? It began, of course, with Nixon going to China in 1972 and opening up China in the original effort by Kissinger to position China as really a counterweight in the Cold War, first the Cold War with the Soviet Union. However, that original effort did not really gain much advantages for China because Kissinger and Nixon very smartly pocketed all the gains, pocketed the concerns of the Soviet Union around this rapprochement, and then used it to achieve a détente with the Soviet Union. And it was only Carter and Brzezinski in 1979 that decided to follow through on the commitments that Kissinger and Nixon had made to China, which they had no intentions of following through on, to actually recognize China, to start trade relations with China, to undo recognition from Taiwan and withdraw American troops from Taiwan. And only when Carter came into office in 1976, with Brzezinski as his national security advisor, did they decide to follow through on those commitments and actually deliver on the promises that had been made. And then, of course, over the next 20 years, there's been both trade relations that were being established, investments, technology transfers, including military sales that took place throughout the 1980s before Tiananmen Square. And then it culminated in the early 2000s with admission of China into the World Trade Organizations, where China had made all sorts of commitments to liberalize its economy, to clean up its act when it comes to intellectual property theft and the like, which it had no interest in following up on. And as a result, we've seen the meteoric expansion of Chinese economy over the last 25 years, taking advantage of the global trade order and being able to dump their goods on the global markets, the so-called China shock. That reverberated not just in America, but really all over the world.
So the second part of this question, America's involvement with China, let's talk about corporate partnerships. How have American big businesses helped to elevate China?
Well, you have a variety of companies that have established, of course, factories and productions, most importantly, Apple in China, that have absolutely helped China move up the value chain from producing really low-end goods to now producing Apple computers, iPhones, and the like, and being able to really excel in the manufacturing of these advanced technologies and being better, let's face it, than anyone else in the world. That wouldn't have happened without that American involvement. When you look at Chinese semiconductor manufacturing industry, companies like SMIC, which are trying to become the leaders, certainly at least in foundational semiconductor space, they could not have become the companies that they did without the financing and the assistance that was offered by companies like Goldman Sachs and the U.S. financial sector that came in the late 90s and early 2000s and helped finance a lot of these companies. So even when you look at the behemoth of industry in China today, they would not have been the large companies and the leaders in their spaces without that American capital, American technology, American access to American markets and the like.
Great. So about 60 more seconds with this question. What is a unique story that you uncovered about American involvement with China over the past few decades? Tell us a story about that.
Well, one of the things that I've had the privilege of being at the front seat of is witnessing the massive intellectual property theft that China has been stealing from the United States and other Western companies literally over the last 25 years. I participated in the investigation of the first major public intrusion from China into an American technology company, Google, and a number of other companies back in 2010. It was the first time that the public had learned that this theft was being done on an enormous scale. And after that, year after year, just been part of numerous investigations into theft across virtually every industry: manufacturing, technology, chemical industries, defense, etc. So the amount of IP that has been taken by China is really the largest transfer of wealth in history, as I had called it back in 2011. It has only gotten bigger since then, and it has helped to fuel this incredible innovation uh, advancements that China has undergone over the last 15 years.
Let's move on to our second question. You make the claim that we are in the midst of the second Cold War because of the many parallels between the original conflict with the Soviet Union and the present day rivalry with China. Can you flesh out this comparison for us?
Yeah, this is one of those things that seems like a complete no-brainer to me, that I can't even believe that anyone would argue that this is not a Cold War. But somehow people have. And let me walk you through my arguments. I believe that there are basically 10 major similarities between the first Cold War and now the second with China. It starts with the fact that there's a global competition for supremacy between the United States and China, much like there was between the United States and the Soviet Union, that plays out in both every geographic corner of the world. It's not just in Asia. It's not just in Africa or Latin America, Europe. It's everywhere, even in the Caribbean. It is playing out in the military sphere. It is playing out in the economic sphere, as we're witnessing today. It is playing out in the technology sphere with export controls and the race for advanced semiconductor production and the like. And it is in geostrategic sphere with concerns around China's relationships with countries like Russia and others around the world. You have preparations for war, right? So we've lived under the sword of Damocles for much of the first Cold War, with the fear of the United States and the Soviet Union going to war. There is now a very palpable fear in the United States, particularly amongst the policy community in the Pentagon, that we might end up in a war with China in the coming decade. We have an arms race, just like we had in the first Cold War, that is both nuclear, with China massively expanding their nuclear arsenal, and the United States actually going through modernization, in large part driven by concerns around China's arsenal of its own nuclear arsenal. And then we have a conventional arms race as well, with huge increases in defense procurement on both sides of this Cold War. We have a space race. Perhaps the defining moment was the race to the moon of the 1960s, with John F. Kennedy, of course, declaring that we would win that race. And we're trying to get back into that race and compete with China and try to get to the moon, land man on the moon before China does, and then get onto Mars from there. We have a scramble for military bases. We're building up capacity in Guam, in Japan, in the Philippines. The Chinese are doing the same things with their friends in the region: Cambodia, Pakistan, even as far away as East Africa and Djibouti. You have an economic war that began really with the IP theft that I've mentioned, that China has been conducting since the early 2000s. But obviously, the United States got into that fight with the first Trump administration instituting tariffs on China, which is now continuing to this day. You have a spy war. The level of espionage against this country is the greatest it's ever been, according to the FBI, in large part because of cyber and the massive amounts of Chinese espionage that is being facilitated through that domain. We have a tech war with the race for AI, semiconductors, space, biotech, a range of those industries. And you have a major regional flashpoint that is Taiwan. And this new Cold War was West Berlin in the first Cold War, where the United States and its adversary Soviet Union in the first Cold War, China, now have the potential to go to war over this critical flashpoint. And lastly, we have an ideological struggle with China, obviously being an authoritarian country that has a mercantilist economy. The United States has a very different system. And the only argument I've heard from people that sort of object to this Cold War characterization is that, look at this economic dependence that exists between the China and the United States, and it can't possibly mean that there's a Cold War. I find that a difficult argument to take seriously when I've just given you a litany of reasons how the two conflicts are incredibly similar and you have one difference that is supposed to outweigh all the others. But even on that one, it's become a lot easier to make my case, I believe, because literally you look at the last month and you've had, of course, virtual trade embargo on US China trade. Due to the 145% tariffs that the Trump administration had instituted. We have a temporary truce on that, but in some 75 odd days, that may very well go back into place. So even on that issue, we're now seeing at least a partial decoupling that is in process and an unwinding of this economic relationship.
Great, Dimitri. Let's move on to our third question. The major focus of your book is the tension between Washington and Beijing as it relates to Taiwan, because Xi Jinping is motivated to absorb the island into the mainland. Why does Taiwan play such an important role in the geopolitical strategy of both nations?
Yeah, this is a great question. Why does Taiwan matter, right? And it's easy to say, well, of course, it's semiconductors. Taiwan produces over 90% of all advanced chips. Even more importantly, produces 40% of all chips, period. So just an enormous manufacturing powerhouse of the most critical technology, arguably, of this digital age, semiconductors. But that's not the only reason why Taiwan matters. The reality is that Taiwan has mattered to the United States for well over a century, long before the age of chips and the age of computing more generally. In 1950, General Douglas MacArthur had declared it the unsinkable aircraft carrier, signifying its critical position in East Asia. The reality is that Taiwan really is the gateway to the Pacific for China. It is key to unlocking China's role as a predominant power in Asia. Because right now, China feels completely constrained by its geography. It is not an enviable position to be in. First of all, they have conflicts, border conflicts with virtually every single one of their neighbors, with the exception of Russia, with whom they had border conflicts that they resolved in the 2000s. But with everyone else, both maritime neighbors and land-based neighbors, they have conflicts. And then when they look around their region, they see themselves as completely surrounded by U.S. allies and American military bases, right? To the very east, they have the Korean Peninsula, half of which is South Korea, with the 28,000 American troops there and a variety of military installations. Further down that arc, you have the Japanese islands, where you have the headquarters of the U.S. Naval 7th Fleet, as well as the Marine Expeditionary Forces on Okinawa. And then on the other side of the arc, in South China Sea, you have the Philippines, where for the first time in 3 decades, the United States military is gaining access to 9 military bases on the Philippines. They're deploying equipment, they're deploying troops there. They recently deployed in the last year the so-called Typhoon intermediate range missile system that can range China, which the Chinese are very, very upset about. And the very center of this first island chain, you have Taiwan, viewed as an outpost of American power, used as this cork that keeps China bottled up, that prevents its navy and its commercial shippings from freely accessing the world's oceans and being able to escape that containment if the United States chooses to blockade them. And of course, China is incredibly reliant on maritime trade. It imports lots of energy, lots of food, lots of raw materials, and it exports, of course, as an export-driven economy, numerous materials all over the world. So this becomes very, very problematic for a power that believes that it is going to emerge this century, potentially by 2049, that they view as the date for their Chinese national rejuvenation, as Xi Jinping calls it, as the world's preeminent superpower, not just equal to the United States, but greater than the United States, which they see as their historic right to be, because for much of human history, over the last 5,000 years, China was the most powerful, the most wealthiest, most populous country on the planet, and it only lost that mantle first to Great Britain and then to the United States with the advent of the Industrial Revolution in the last couple of hundred years. So it believes that it is reemerging after a century of humiliation in the 1800s through the early 1900s to that rightful place, and it can't allow another power, its primary rival, the United States, to put itself in a position to blockade China in that way. So taking Taiwan would allow them to escape that containment and change the entire geopolitics of Asia and kick the United States out of that region, one of the most important regions of the world.
We have another 60 seconds here. Can you talk a little bit more about the importance of chips? And semiconductors.
Yeah. Well, nothing in the modern world can really be built without semiconductors, right? Not your cars, not your microwaves, not your dishwashers, certainly not any of the computing devices that you have. Taiwan is that power center that produces 40% of all chips. There's no prospect in the next decade that dependence on Taiwan and semiconductor manufacturing would diminish at all, given just the scale of production that exists there. TSMC, one of the most valuable companies in the world, that is the leader in advanced chip manufacturing, is projected to build one fab a year in Taiwan for the next 10 years. They committed to building three over a number of years in Arizona, here in the United States. So the scale is just not replaceable. The talent that is in Taiwan, the whole ecosystem of the supply chain that is there, is going to be there at least for the next decade, if not longer. So whoever controls, of course, that ecosystem, if China is able to take control of it, is going to have enormous leverage over the global economy. And then if there's a conflict, you might see destruction of those facilities that would irreparably harm the global economy.
Dimitri, let's move on to our fourth question. You write about the need to be clear-eyed about the economic, political, and cultural differences between authoritarian systems and the liberal democratic worldview. Can you explain the weaknesses that the CCP's style of governance poses for China's future and the inherent strengths of America's leadership?
Yeah, when you look at the strengths of America, I call it the five eyes that I believe have contributed to America becoming the dominant economic power and thus military power over the last century. And they are innovation, investment, influence, ideas, and immigration. So on the innovation side, it's indisputable that the top companies in the world that are the most innovative, particularly in technology, but many other areas as well, are in the United States, right? The Apples, the Qualcomms, the NVIDIAs of the world, the Googles, Microsofts, SpaceX, you name it. We also have the top universities in the world, and that's also undisputable because much of the rest of the world wants to send their kids, including Xi Jinping's own daughter that went to Harvard, to our universities to study, to learn, to participate in research that is done at the cutting edge of those systems. That is really, from an innovation perspective, an enormous strength of America. The second one is investment. When you want to start a company, there's no better place to start it than in the United States for several reasons. One, you have incredible access to funding, right? My own company that I founded, CrowdStrike, we've raised $1.1 billion through the public IPO of the company since its founding, right? Very, very difficult to raise that anywhere else. We have over 10,000 banks and credit unions in this country, thousands of venture capital firms, private equity firms, family offices that can all invest in new startups, new business ideas. We have more banks and credit unions per capita than anywhere else in the world by a large margin. So that access to capital gives us an absolute dominant position and helps fuel that innovation ecosystem. And then we have a single market. There's lots of innovative companies that are being created all over the world, in Europe and Israel, etc. And most of these companies, once they start getting product market fit, double down on the US market because it is the biggest market in the world. It is easier to sell in the US market than anywhere else, right? You might think that the European Union is a huge market, and it is, but the reality is it's actually over 24 different countries with their own systems, regulations, language barriers, go-to-market strategies that you have to adopt to. But the way you sell in Seattle is the exact same way that you sell in Birmingham, Alabama, in the United States. And that is an enormous advantage of the United States. On the influence side, we have the US dollar, the US military, and our alliance networks that are really unchallenged. The US dollar remains the dominant currency in the world, despite all the challenges and the debt that and the fiscal issues that we have. The US military, by far the strongest military in the world, that helps to ensure and protect the world's trade routes for American goods globally, and an alliance network that is unmatched in human history, with both NATO and partners in the Indo-Pacific like Japan, Australia, South Korea, and the Philippines. On the ideas front, we have a constant capacity to reinvent ourselves and to try different ideas, some good, some bad, but then pivot and when something is not working, go into totally different directions. It's really a marketplace of ideas that is built into our governing framework, our constitution, that China does not have, and an immigration system, finally, that allows us to import the world's best talent into this country, allows us to sustain a demographic growth where much of the rest of the world is in a decline. We would be as well since the 1970s if we didn't have immigration to compensate for the lack of natural born American births in this country. So, as a result of all of those five things, innovation, investment, influence, ideas, and immigration, America has enormous advantages over China. China is lacking in all of these areas. It's trying to catch up. Its universities are getting better. Obviously, it has more and more innovative companies that are coming to fruition. It has a relatively large investment climate, but it doesn't have the influence. It doesn't have the ideas. It doesn't have the immigration. And as long as we don't screw it up, I'm confident that we can win this new Cold War with China and avoid a hot war and deter conflict. But we have to use those strengths in a smart way.
Great, Dimitri. Let's move on to our final question. Your book concludes with recommendations for a more coherent economic strategy and to more effectively engage with friendly countries. What can American policymakers do to be more effective in the realms of innovation and foreign policy?
Yeah, I really talk about two things that are really important to win this new Cold War. One is to invest in innovation, and to do so in a both offensive and defensive way. So one is we have to prevent a semiconductor or chip breakout in China. We have to prevent them from getting access to our advanced chips, and more importantly, prevent them from achieving independence in production of advanced chips by denying them access to the most sophisticated machines man has ever built, which are these semiconductor manufacturing equipment systems from companies like ASML, Applied Materials, Lam, KLA, Tokyo Electron, and Nikon. Those machines that can etch a transistor on a piece of silicon that's thinner than a human hair are truly a marvel of human innovation. China is very far behind in that space, despite all their investments, despite all their attempts to steal technology. We still have an advantage, and we need to preserve it and cut off sale of that equipment to China to severely impede their semiconductor manufacturing industry. At the same time, we need to encourage innovation here domestically through a range of policies, direct investments, and market access policies that can help to bring this innovation and expand it in America. We have to invest in critical material supplies. This is one area of major weakness that we have, where many of the critical minerals that we need, whether it's rare earths, whether it's lithium, cobalt, nickel, aluminum, etc., are coming from China because they've dominated the refining and processing in that sector for so long. We need to make sure that we develop alternatives for refining and processing of those minerals. Mining happens in lots of places, but refining and processing is chokehold in China because of their subsidies and dumping practices. That can be changed through policy. We have to enable skill-based immigration. Right? I'm not for open borders. I don't think that just anyone that jumps over the fence should be allowed to come into this country, particularly if they're unvetted. But from a perspective of attracting the very best talent, people that want to come here with PhDs, master's degrees, engineering degrees, that want to start companies, that want to participate in building great companies here, we should encourage that and make it as easy as possible. And we need to invest in innovation, whether it's AI and autonomy, biotech and synthetic biology, space, aerospace, green energy. All those areas are going to require a permissive environment here in the United States for investment from a permanent reform perspective, tax credits, and the like. And then the second strategy is to defend innovation. A lot of that is military based. We need to reform our defense procurement. We need to focus on building cheaper weapons in greater numbers because quantity has a quality of its own, as is often said. We need to reform our defense industrial base, rationalize very expensive projects that we can no longer afford, given our fiscal situation and huge numbers. We need to sanction industries in China that benefited from industrial espionage that they've conducted to limit their power going forward. And really focus on what I call unidirectional entanglement. not a decoupling from China that I don't think you can achieve given the scale of the Chinese economy and given its entanglement with the rest of the world. But we need to reduce our dependence in critical industries on China, like critical minerals, for example. And we need to increase their dependence on us in other areas like semiconductors to prevent them from manufacturing their own.
So the second part of this question, and we have about 90 seconds here, is American foreign policy. How can that be made to be more effective?
Well, I think we need to take a hard look at our alliances. They've been a source of strength for us, but frankly, there's been also a lot of free riding on the part of allies, particularly in Europe, when it comes to security issues. You're seeing the Trump administration really put a lot of pressure on European partners to say to them that, look, if the United States, God forbid, is in a conflict with China, by necessity, most of the assets we have in Europe will come to the Indo-Pacific because we do not have the ability to fight a two-front war. So if you want to make sure that Vladimir Putin or whoever replaces him does not take advantage of the crisis in the Pacific and does something adventurous in Europe, you're going to have to defend yourself. This is not even an ideological debate. This is just the reality of the capacity of the United States military and where we are today. So encouraging the Europeans to take more of a control of their own destiny and their own defense is really, really important. But I believe also it's important to give carrots to our allies to make sure that they know that we have their back should they be pressured by someone like Russia or China. And I put together an idea that I call TAME, Treaty of Allied Market Economies, basically an economic version of NATO for countries that are coming under economic coercion, particularly from China, but other dictatorial regimes as well. Countries like Australia, Japan, Lithuania, Taiwan that have come under these enormous pressure, whether it's tariff pressure or export and import controls that China has instituted on these nations. And if they're part of this alliance framework, the whole alliance can retaliate on their behalf and actually create a deterrent effect that NATO has had in the military domain and apply it into the economic sphere.
Dimitri, that has been 5 questions, and you have answered it amazingly. Thank you so much for joining us on Books in Five. The title of the book is World on the Brink. Dimitri, if you have a few extra minutes, I have a few bonus questions for you.
Of course.
Dimitri, and you mentioned this in the book, but I want to hear your thoughts on this. How did you get into this line of work, first in cybersecurity and now in policy?
Well, I got into cybersecurity when I was a kid in high school. My dad and I started a company doing cryptography back in the mid 90s, and that's what started my passion for cybersecurity. But I've always also been passionate about foreign affairs, studied in a college, and saw this merger of the two passions of my life, technology and cyber, and international affairs. Really after that Google hack that I called Operation Aurora, when it became clear that cyber was used to achieve national security priorities for our adversaries. And I realized that the two issues interlinked. And that's what actually got me to start paying attention to what China was doing at the time when everyone was still enamored with the rise of China and how the greater market in China is going to help American industry, and people wanted to invest more in China. And I saw the dark side of it pretty early on, that this is not just all positive, that they're trying to steal our IP, they're trying to build competitors to our products. And I had a hard time convincing the US government at the time to focus on it, to convince them that no, if they're stealing, that will not impede their innovation, that will actually accelerate it, as has proven to be the case.
Dimitri, you've had an exciting career in business and in policy now. What is an accomplishment that you're most proud of?
Well, I'll always be very proud of creating one of the iconic cybersecurity companies that is now, close or over $100 billion in market cap, and has thousands of people working for them, and has protected numerous companies around the world. But now I'm very proud of the second phase of my life of giving back. Silverado is a nonprofit that my family is supporting to help advance American prosperity and making sure that this century remains an American century like the last one was, and that new immigrants to this country and Americans born here can take advantage of the same opportunities that I was afforded to as a new immigrant, as a kid coming to this country. when I was about 13 years old.
Dimitri, our last question here for you. What are you working on next? Another book or doing more work with Silverado? Tell us a little bit more about what your next 12 months look like.
Well, I'm very squarely focused on these issues of the pronouncements, the ideas that I have in the book about what the United States should do to make sure that we win this race for the 21st century. I'm working on that every day with the executive branch, with the legislative branch here in Washington, D.C., trying to get those ideas to be implemented by the United States government. And I expect to do that for the foreseeable future. People always ask me what the next book is going to be on. Of course, in the book, I talk about my concern that in 2028 through 2032 period, somewhere in those 4 years, we might see China attempt to invade Taiwan. I jokingly say that my next book will be in 2032 of how people should have listened to me, or maybe a thank you for listening, and that we have avoided a catastrophic conflict.
Dimitri, thank you so much for joining us on Books in Five. Again, the title of the book is World on the Brink. I will put a link to the book in the show notes, and I definitely recommend everybody go out and buy it or borrow it from their library. However you get your hands on it, you should definitely read it. Dimitri, thank you for joining us.
Thanks for having me.
The host of Books in Five is Bhavan Sodhan. Books in Five is produced in collaboration with Podfather Creative in Vancouver, Canada.